Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. You've been, of course, learning about different topics such as the Franks and the Carolingian Empire and the invasions that take place in Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries with the Magyars and the Moors and the Vikings, and of course the development of feudalism. Well, today's lecture we will focus on the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, the Holy Roman Empire is a collection of states in Central Europe. And you'll see, of course, with this upcoming lecture, remembering, of course, Charlemagne and the Carolingian dynasty and how they will eventually die out. And we start seeing, of course, that some of these German dukes will start electing their what they call Holy Roman Emperors here in Central Europe. Not just, of course, to rule over Central Europe, loosely the collection of states. We're not talking unity. We don't have a unified Germany and we don't have a unified Italy at this time. That comes much, much later. But they also, of course, control a lot of northern Italy as well. You'll hear quite a lot about the Ottonian dynasty, men like Otto I or Otto the Great, as he was called by some, and how he will actually push the Magyars, defeat the Magyars, one of those groups of invaders that we've talked about in 9th and 10th century at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955. And of course, you'll also learn a little bit about how Otto is kind of compared a bit to Charles Martel. You've heard Charles Martel's name when we discuss the Merovingian dynasty and the Carolingian dynasty and that long-lasting Germanic tribe called the Franks in a previous lecture. And how some would see Otto I as the savior of Europe from those ruthless, the Magyars. In fact, the Magyars, and you've learned this in the past as well, will eventually settle in what is known as Hungary, because they are, of course, Hungarian as well. You'll also learn about how Otto is crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And the first time this title was really used. Charlemagne, you learned in a previous lecture, was given the title King of the Romans. And Otto is crowned as a Holy Roman Emperor. And as we continue with our lectures, you'll hear that title quite often because we'll start to see that in these different German states, what will eventually come about is that they will have princes in each state. And these princes will elect, they will be electors, and they will elect the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, that doesn't necessarily always mean that the Holy Roman Emperor is all-powerful. In fact, we have quite a few weak Holy Roman Emperors throughout this history of the Holy Roman Empire. You'll also, of course, learn about the Holy Roman Empire as its relation to the church at this time. This will actually be a very common theme throughout the Middle Ages, where the secular rulers will try and, of course, dominate or control the papacy. And we'll see, of course, especially during the High Middle Ages, that some of the popes will start to take that power back. One very successful and very powerful High Middle Age Pope was named Innocent III. And he will, of course, be very prominent in getting more prestige and more power for the church. But we'll see, not just between the Holy Roman Empire and the church, of course that's our topic for today, but we'll also see the French. A French king by the name of Philip IV or Philip the Fair will try and dominate power, of course, over the church in Rome. You'll also learn, of course, about, we do have a dynasty here. We have some other Ottos that take over, Otto II, We have rebellions in Germany during his time. Managed, of course, to keep the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, together. But we do see some invasions. And when he died, his son was very, very, very small. And so when the next Otto III, comes along around 983, it's not very easy to be a very powerful, strong king when you're only, say, 14 years old when he takes over. 14, can you believe that? He died when he was about 22. So what we see here in the Holy Roman Empire is a series of different rulers, not always dynastic. The Carolingians will die out, and we'll start to see these elected German emperors, Holy Roman emperors. But they're not always father-son, as we'll see throughout the Holy Roman Empire history. We do, of course, have different dynasties that will take over. At one point, we have, I call them the Hohenstaufens, the dynasty, or the Fredericks there that will rule in the High Middle Ages at one point in the Holy Roman Empire. So let's learn more about the Holy Roman Empire.
Hi. During the last lecture, we looked at the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire, and we saw the reasons that Charlemagne's old empire was divided, and that's largely due to the old Frankish custom of all males receiving an equal portion of their father's territory. So whereas Charlemagne only had one son left alive when he died, and that of course was Louis the Pious, Louis had three sons. Well, when the dust settled, there were three sons, and so his empire was divided amongst three. The middle portion, known as Lotharingia, is further subdivided into three, and gradually it disappears as the brothers who inherited the West Frankland, that is Charles the Bald, and Louis the German, who inherited the East Frankland, quarrel with Lothar's descendants and others. But the general theme of the latter half of the 9th century, after the Treaty of Verdun, after 843, is one of decentralization, is one of feudalism, it's one of particularism, of political localism. And really, in this time, in this environment, in this region, there was no way that any strong, stable, central authority could remain united. And we saw that this was compounded by the rounds of invasions that we've seen from the Vikings from the north, who attacked well, all along the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, the Magyars, or the Hungarians from the east, who came on horseback and looted and plundered much of Central and Western Europe, and the Saracens, or the men from the east, who were actually Muslims from North Africa, who came north and looted the larger islands in the Italian peninsula, and even as far deep as the Alps mountains. So the period 850 to 950, it's not a particularly happy period politically in Western Europe, because of all of these problems, because of the internal fighting amongst the successors of Charlemagne, and the external fighting as we have invaders, pagan Vikings, pagan Magyars, and Islamic Saracens coming up from the south. So the period 850 to 950 is a very, very tumultuous period in European history. Now, what starts to happen is that by 950, things begin to calm down, and they certainly have calmed down by the year 1000 for sure. The Magyars are defeated at the Battle of Lechfeld by Otto, as we'll see in 955. By the year 1000, they've converted to Christianity, and they've become a part of kind of the nation states of the year 1000. The Magyars are accepted in the community of states and accept Christianity directly from Rome. At the same time, around the year 1000, the Vikings convert to Christianity, and their states, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, will all accept Christianity through their kings. So we'll have a stabilization that occurs around the year 1000, although the stabilization occurs earlier in some areas than in others. Now, one of the effects of these invasions was, of course, the acceleration of the feudal process. And that is the way in which kings are forced to divide up their land in order to get the best and most able fighters. And so they begin to attach public services or public duties to private land. And you can use this parcel of land for your lifetime if you fight for me for 40 days a year, if you give me a present when I have my eldest son knighted, if you give me a present when I have my eldest daughter married, etc. These are the types of trends that were occurring in, all throughout Western and Central Europe, to the extent that in the area of the West Franks, West Frankland or Francia, it's not yet France yet, so you can't call it that. But what happened is that the kings had very, very little land. In fact, most of their land had been given away, and their vassals, or people who were technically their vassals, counts and dukes, often were more powerful than they were. So the Count of Toulouse might have a lot more land, a lot more authority, and although technically he's a subordinate to the king, when summoned to Paris, he may not even go because geographically he's so far away, and the king really can't enforce his will over Toulouse because it's simply too far away. Likewise, the Duchy of Normandy. The counties that Rollo, the Danish chieftain, had initially received and expanded, the Duchy of Normandy along the coast of the North Sea, despite the fact that it's along the Seine River and right near the city of Paris, often it was de facto independent. So really, in the 9th and the early 10th centuries, the king of the West Franks becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And the history that we have is one of dukes and counts. The last Carolingian survives until 987. And so throughout most of the 10th century, we'll have Carolingian kings, with one exception, in the area of the West Frankland. But in 987, we'll have a change of dynasty. What happens is, in the area of the West Frankland, the Carolingians, for all practical purposes, die out. So there's not a clear descendant of Charlemagne to select as king. So the dukes and the counts get together and they decide that they're going to elect a king. Now, this was an ancient Germanic tradition, the election of kings, going all the way back to when the Germans first entered the Roman territories in the 4th century. But in 987, at this particular election, the dukes and the counts agreed to elect a man named Hugh Capet as king of the West Franks. Hugh Capet. Now, he is elected because he's Count of Paris, but he's a fairly weak figure. He doesn't have very much land. He doesn't have a whole lot of authority. Many people say the Counts of Toulouse, the Dukes of Normandy, have much larger estates than he does. So he's kind of elected to be almost a figurehead, because you need a king. Despite the fact that the kings are incompetent or impotent, you still need a king as a figurehead, right? So you need a king there. So Hugh is elected king, and what happens is he says, he tells the dukes and the counts, being a king, it's a lot of work. I need some help. And he says, how about this? How about I have my eldest son crowned co-king while I'm still alive? And the dukes and the counts talked about it, and they didn't particularly care for it, but they realized that kingship probably was an odious burden, and maybe he needed some help. And so they granted King Hugh to have his eldest son crowned co-king while he was still alive. Then, when Hugh died, what did that mean? That meant the king was already in place, his eldest son. Of course, his eldest son will have his eldest son crowned while he's still alive. And Hugh's family will continue this tradition into the 12th century. So that is a system, they will continue the system of having their eldest son crowned co-king while they're still alive. And this is the beginning of primogeniture, which we'll see in the area of the West Frankland. So Hugh will be king of the West Franks, his successors will be the kings of the West Franks, and then this, in theory, the principle of Germanic election dies out altogether because the successor is already in place. Okay? Now, it's important to remember that for almost 200 years, the descendants of Hugh Capet need to do this. But after 200 years, the trend has been set. And in order to be a king, you need to be the eldest son of the surviving king. So Hugh Capet founds a dynasty, the Capetian dynasty. And this dynasty will rule France throughout most of the Middle Ages. And French history from 987 onwards is the history of the kings gradually getting back power from the counts and the dukes that they lost during the Carolingian period and during the invasions. Okay? The Capetian dynasty will last from the 10th century into the early 14th century. The Capetians are extremely lucky because they will, on average, reign for about 20 years, which is a pretty good period of rule, so there's not going to be a lot of instability with a quick 1 or 2 year rule. The Capetians are also very, very lucky by the genetic roll of the dice, and that for over 300 years, they're always able to produce sons, and sons that survive. So there never will be a succession crisis in the kingdom of the West Franks, that there's a son ready. And as it happens, when the Capetian line does die out in the 14th century, the closest male claimant to the throne of France will be the King of England. And so this will lead to another new crisis and eventually lead to the 100 Years' War, a very long conflict between England and France over who is the rightful king in France. Now, in the area of the East Frank land, if we move over in the eastern portion of Charlemagne's old empire, so the area that would include Saxony, Bavaria, and Franconia, central Germany, northern central Germany, and the Slavic frontier. If we look over into that territory, in the area of the East Franks, the last Carolingian died out in 911, so at the very beginning of the 10th century. So there's no more Carolingian king of the East Franks. And what do? Well, the area of the East Franks was much different from the area of the West Franks, because the area of the West Franks had at one point been Gaul. Okay, and it had been very, very Romanized. It included the provinces of Aquitaine and Provence, which were very, very Romanized. So at least in Gaul, there still was, or in the area of the West Frankland, there was still some residual Roman infrastructure left over. So, we've seen Charlemagne's administrative techniques. There was still some Roman residual infrastructure left. And so there were, counties and divisions that remained. The East Frankland was quite different because most of it was never part of the Roman Empire. And so some areas had only recently been civilized at all, such as Saxony. Remember, Charlemagne had to fight against the Saxons for well over 30 years before the area was incorporated in the empire. Other areas, Bavaria, had only been recently incorporated into the Frankish state by Pepin and then Charlemagne. Many of these areas had Merovingian connections, but very few of these areas had Roman connections. And so there's not any type of really residual infrastructure to fall back on after the invasions and after the East begins to stabilize. So what happens is when the last Carolingian dies in the area of the East Frankland, we'll have an election. But the election is interesting because what emerges is in the area of the East Frankland, we have the appearance of duchies. Okay? In the West Frankland, we have duchies, which are usually combinations of many, many counties. Count rules over a county, duke rules over a duchy. The duchies that emerge in the area of the East Frankland, though, however, happen to be tribal in appearance. That is, Saxony reemerges as a duchy. And of course, Saxony was the old tribal homeland for the Saxons. Bavaria, and of course, Bavaria was the old tribal homeland for the Bavarians. Swabia, the area where the Swabians had lived. Franconia, which was the old homeland of the Franks. And then there were other duchies too. Lotharingia was a duchy, but of course that was the kind of the residual remnant of Lothar's old empire. But in the East, we talk about stem duchies or tribal duchies because in the absence of any real Roman infrastructure, we start to see the reemergence of a tribal complexion. And real power in areas of the East Frankland lie within the 5 major duchies, which were Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Bavaria, and Lotharingia. Now, what happens is when the last Carolingian dies out, kingship becomes elective. And as the dukes gather to discuss who they want, they realize it's in their best interest to select a weak king. That is, you want a king because you need a king, but you also want a king that's not going to hamper or thwart your own interests. So you want a king who will be king, but at the same time, you want to be able to expand your power base and to incorporate more territory. And the person who's elected the first king of the East Franks is a man named Conrad, and Conrad was Duke of Franconia. Now, he's elected king in 911. And he discovers very, very quickly that kingship is only a title. He has ties to the Carolingians through his mother, so he can claim some Carolingian ancestry. But it becomes very clear that the German dukes all want to retain their own identity, their ducal identity. And very quickly, he loses Lotharingia to Charles the Simple of the West Franks. He alienates the dukes by trying to, consolidate his own power. He attempts to ally with the local clergy. He could not even get the dukes together to deal with the threat of the Magyars. We have Magyar incursions all throughout East Francia, and no duke is willing to be interested in trying to consolidate their own power with his, and the Magyar threat becomes more of a local issue, that the Duke of Saxony will deal with the Magyars in his own way, while the Duke of Swabia will deal with them in his own. So Conrad's reign as king was not very successful, and he couldn't even establish control over the royal crown lands. So the first model we have for kingship in East Frankland after the extinction of the Carolingians is a very, very weak model. So a very, very weak king, kind of similar to Hugh Capet, where you could very easily ignore him in the area of the West Franks. The second king elected in the area of the East Frankland is Henry the Fowler, and he had been Duke of Saxony. He was elected in 918, and actually he will found a dynasty, the Saxon dynasty. Now, he was actually selected by Conrad to be king, but then he was confirmed or re-elected by the German dukes. So Conrad appointed a successor, which was then re-elected, but they also wanted to make sure the dynastic principle didn't succeed. So we're going to bounce from one duchy to another, from Franconia to Saxony, to make sure that no one candidate establishes a large power base. The dukes at this point realized that they needed a stronger king than Conrad, because the Magyar threats were continuing, and in fact the Danish threat was continuing, and Saxony was being plundered by Danish raids. So we have Vikings in the north and Magyars on the east. Now Henry in 918, he's known as Henry the Fowler, and this is why, is that when emissaries were sent to announce to him that he'd been elected king, he was out fowling. That was his sport, and that was one of his favorite activities. And so these ambassadors brought the regalia, all of the royal gear, to give to Henry, and he's out fowling. And what he does is, once he becomes king in 918, he spends probably the first 6 years getting the other kings to recognize his rule. So he enforces the military aid. With feudalism, there are certain rights and responsibilities, and one of them is military aid, usually 40 days of services, depending on where you are. So Henry begins to enforce that. He also has certain rights and privileges which really have been abused during this time and have been abused, will continue to be abused. But the king has the right to name certain bishoprics and archbishoprics within his realm. And one of the things that you can do is you can appoint bishops and archbishops in the duchy of somebody else, and they can kind of, depending on their own disposition, they can be your eyes and ears, and they can help with your own particular political interests or political reform program. Okay, good. Now, what else? After he's recognized as king, he begins to reorganize his kingdom, forces the other dukes to recognize his reign. He appoints bishops and archbishops, and Henry begins the basis of what actually will be a very strong form of kingship in the area of the East Franks or Germany. Once he's recognized as king, he buys a truce with the Magyars, with the Hungarians. And really, it's only effective in Saxony. And that, of course, is his home duchy. And he spends much time building forts and fortifications. So, while the Magyars begin to raid other areas of the Eastern Frankland, he makes sure that Saxony is protected. Henry also begins a policy of fighting the Slavic peoples to the east. And so this policy that we see in German history, the Drag nach Osten, or the push to the east, becomes very, very common even in the 10th century. And so Brandenburg, which was an old Slavic fort, is captured as Henry the Fowler begins to fortify the eastern portions of his Duchy of Saxony. Now, finally, in 933, he stopped paying tribute to the Magyars. He felt that he was in a strong enough position where he no longer had to keep paying them tribute. And in fact, as tribute to the Magyars, he gave them a dog whose ears and tails had been clipped off as a clear insult. And the Magyars were so insulted, they immediately invaded Saxony, but Henry was able to get them in a pitched battle for the first time. 933, he's able to defeat the Magyars. This was unheard of. The Magyars up to this point had not been defeated, and it was very difficult to get them in a fixed battle. Once the Magyars, were defeated, he almost immediately has this international aura about him that, he defeated the Magyars. He's the only one who could do this. So this established him as a worthy king, and he's a hero. The following year, in 934, the Danes invade Saxony. He's able to push them back, and he's able to reoccupy land which the Danes had taken way back in the days of Louis the Pious. So he's able to accumulate more land from the Saxons, or from the Slavs rather, and then from the Danes. He was so successful that he tells the dukes, I think I want my son to succeed me. And the dukes were first a little bit apprehensive, but they said yes, because we have a period of strong kingship. The Danes, the Magyars were defeated. This was unheard of. So it looks like this might be a very successful and prosperous period in the kingdom of the East Franks. And Henry the Fowler is allowed to have his son Otto succeed him. And Otto will be known as Otto the Great. And Otto becomes king in 936. And he continues his dad's policy. He is universally elected as king, and this is done at Aachen. And you can see the propaganda interest of this. That was Charlemagne's old court. So he's elected king at Aachen and formally crowned there. So he's tapping into these ancient imperial traditions. So crowned at Aachen in the presence of everyone. A couple of things that he does. He has several revolts throughout his kingdom and actually absorbs several duchies. And so he deals with ducal rebellions by simply absorbing the territories or selecting new dukes. And so Otto's the first person to really break the power of the ducal leaders and establish what will appear to be a very, very strong kingship within the eastern part of the Frankland. One thing, too, is he realizes that, when he confiscates duchies, the easiest thing to do is to give them out to a family member, to follow a policy, what we would call nepotism. But the problem is that after 15 or 20 years, the family member probably isn't as loyal to you. He might have different interests. And so we start to see kind of a breakdown. And certainly after a generation or two, they're not going to be loyal. So what Otto has to stew with is the idea of how we can control these other duchies. And he comes up with the conclusion of the best way to control these duchies is do not give them to family members, rather give them to churchmen. And that is, you make a bishop or an archbishop a duke of an area. And the advantage of that is that the duke and the archbishop, or the archbishop as duke, is not going to have any children. And so that way, once the archbishop dies, the land will escheat or return to the king. And so the king will then be free to reward it to another area. We call this the Ottonian system of government. And this Ottonian system of government means using ecclesiastical personnel in all levels of administration. So you not only use them in your own curia, but you use bishops and archbishops as dukes. And of course, Otto pushed for celibacy amongst the higher clergy. And this was usually the norm at this point, but not always. So churches and bishops become feudal lords. They are absorbed into this whole feudal pyramid. And actually, churches will supply much of his manpower in his military missions. In fact, when he invades Italy, as we'll see, 70% of his manpower comes from ecclesiastical lands. So in this Ottonian system of government, you bring the best educated class of people directly under your control by incorporating ecclesiastics. You use ecclesiastics to counterbalance feudal lords, because feudal lords always have their own interests and their family interests in mind. And as an example, Otto has the Archbishop of Cologne appointed Duke of Lotharingia. So you have an ecclesiastical person ruling over duchy. Obviously, the Archbishop of Cologne is not going to try to make it a hereditary position. So when he dies, it'll revert back to the king, who will then be free to give it out to another ecclesiastic or a family member, or whoever he chooses to give it to. All right. Now, He also, like his father, heavily intervenes in Slavic areas. So we'll have a thin veneer of a Germanic presence in Central and Eastern Europe, which will increase over time throughout the 11th to the 12th centuries as more and more of these areas become heavily Germanized. The last Carolingian claimant in Italy actually died in 924. There was still a title, King of Italy, who was a Carolingian descendant. And he died in 924. His heir was a woman named Adelaide. And she was, for a while, in the 930s and 940s, probably the most eligible woman in Western Europe. And what Otto did is, when he invaded northern Italy, he married Adelaide. And so the title King of Italy went with Otto through this important marriage. The crowning achievement of Otto's reign, though, was in 955. In 955, Otto defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld. And the Magyars, after Lechfeld, never attacked the East Franks once again. Instead, they settled down. They settled down on the Hungarian plateau. And really, Otto became compared with Charles Martel, the same way that Charles Martel had saved Western Christendom. Otto had saved Western Christendom from the pagan Magyars. So Otto becomes as important as Charles Martel. And so he's a savior of Christianity. These ruthless pagans, as they were depicted in the royal propaganda, began to settle down. As we've seen, by the year 1000, the Hungarians have become Christianized and become members of the larger European states. Now, there had been trouble brewing in Italy, though. While Otto had been defeating Slavs and Magyars, trouble is brewing in Italy. And there are things going on. The Papal States, the area that Pepin had given to Rome back in the 8th century, the donation of Pepin, which Rome claimed had already been given to it by the Emperor Constantine, donation of Constantine, the area of central Italy that was ruled directly by the Pope is known as the Papal States. In the 10th century, there were several problems in the Papal States. And these problems largely radiated to the instability that emerged during the invasions. That is, as the Vikings and the Magyars and the Saracens attacked Europe, Rome no longer had a secular patron. That previous popes could call down Pepin or Charlemagne or Louis the Pious for assistance, but when we really don't have a central authority, the popes can't rely on anyone. And so street fighting became very, very common in Rome, and often the papal title was received by means of political violence. And so there was a lot of political violence within the city of Rome. And in the 950s, we have one pope, Pope John XII, who finds himself in some serious trouble. He has renegades in central Italy that are trying to abduct the Papal States and take control of the city of Rome. And politically, he's in trouble. So he needs help. And he looks around and he looks to Otto. He looks to the emperor of the Eastern Franks for help. And he says, Otto, can you help me? And Otto invades Italy, and he defeats the rebels who had been threatening the Papal States and the city of Rome. And in the year 962, what John XII did is to celebrate his victory over the rebels, is he has Otto crowned. Otto's crowned emperor. However, the title that Otto is given is Holy Roman Emperor. The title that Charlemagne had been given was Emperor of the Romans. Now, Holy Roman Emperor means something quite different because he's, not just a Roman emperor, he's holy. So there's a certain kind of holiness which permeates the title and the person. So he is Holy Roman Emperor in 962, and German historians note this date, 962, as the beginning of the First Reich. And the First Reich will last almost 1,000 years because the First Reich is the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire will survive in some form from 962 until its defeat by Napoleon in 1806. But once Otto is given the title Holy Roman Emperor, what he does is he seems to think that he could take the Suetonian system of government to the highest ranks of the church. And what Otto does is he confirms the donation of Pepin, that the popes control the Papal States, but he presents it to Pope John almost as a fief. And then Otto demands that no pope be consecrated until the emperor approves them, and begins to make demands on John XII, which infuriate him. And he doesn't want to deal with this because he feels like he's being treated like a subordinate. And he makes it very clear he won't. And Otto is upset by John's change of heart. Pope John XII instead sides with the rebels, and he sides with those who'd been trying to attack the papal states to begin with. He even allies with the Magyars, who are still pagan, and he asks the Magyars to come down and to do something about Otto. Now, Otto at this point is furious. He's just been crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Now he's in a big dispute with the Pope. What he does is he summons a council which deposes John XII. And this council begins to elect a new Pope, and John XII is chased out of the city of Rome. Now, in reality, what happens is John XII will eventually come back, but by the end of Otto's reign, what starts to become the standard is that the kings of the East Franks, or the German kings, in order to become a Holy Roman Emperor, you need to be crowned by the Pope. But that Pope is usually somebody that you've selected yourself. For about a 100-year period, the papacy will fall under this Ottonian system of government, and we'll have several kings of the East Franks or kings of the Germans who come down to Rome and will depose popes and select a new one. As an example, when Henry III comes down to Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, there are 3 different people claiming to be Pope. So he simply deposes them all and selects a new one. And to their credit, the German kings usually do a pretty good job of selecting popes, often a better job than the citizens of Rome do themselves. And they usually will pick popes who are reformers or attached to reform movements, who want to do things to try to invigorate the church rather than keep the status quo. Now, Otto is our first Holy Roman Emperor. Now, his last big claim is that he receives a Byzantine princess, Theophano, for his son. So the dukes agree that his son can inherit as Otto II, and now he marries a Byzantine princess. So we've established a history of both Romes. We've got a Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe, but it's one that has connections with Constantinople, the old Roman Empire. And so we have blood relations between these two. Otto II, when he becomes king, he has a lot of difficulty keeping his kingdom intact because we have new Slavic invasions. He dies on an Italian excursion, and when he dies, his son's only 3 years old. And so when Otto III comes to the throne, he comes to the throne at age 14, and he's kind of an unusual Holy Roman Emperor because although a German, he speaks both Greek and Latin, through his mom, Theophano, the Byzantine princess. He calls his reign a renovation of the Roman Empire. He's very keen ideas on empire. He's very austere. He likes pilgrimages. He's friends with the best educated churchmen of the day. The problem is that he dies very, very young, and he dies childless. So Otto was able to create a dynasty, but it won't get past his grandson. And this is a problem which we'll see again and again within the Holy Roman Empire, that once the direct heir dies and there's no clear descendant, what happens is the issue will be thrown back to the dukes, and the dukes will select somebody new. And generally, they'll select somebody who's from a completely different dynasty in order to prevent one ducal family from becoming too powerful. And this is the pattern which we'll see again and again throughout the history of the East Franks. Now, when Otto dies, he'll be succeeded by Henry II, who will become Holy Roman Emperor too, but from a cadet branch of the Saxon house. And most of Henry II's lands are largely in Bavaria. He will die without heirs, and then the dukes will bounce back to Franconia and other geographical areas. So this is the issue that we'll see. The dukes generally, in times of stability, want a very, very weak king. And so whereas the principle of primogeniture will win the day in the area of the West Franks, it will not in the area of the East Franks for a variety of problems. Now, we'll have a series of kings, the most important one of which is Henry III. Henry III becomes king in 1039 and is later crowned Holy Roman Emperor. But what he does is he begins to build up his holdings in the empire effectively after the death of Otto III. The royal power within the empire starts to weaken. Henry III had some land in Franconia and some in Swabia. So he tries to build up a power base in kind of central Germany. He builds royal castles. Again, he appoints ecclesiastical personnel. He also staffs them with a new class of people who are known as ministeriales. Henry III starts the use of ministeriales, and these are essentially peasant people who have no real ties to anyone, but they're recruited from the royal ducal lands, and then they're brought into the administration. So this is a way for him to rely on a new core of personnel for his chanceries, for administration, and even for the army and for other purposes. And so this way he creates a group of people who are directly loyal to him without having to rely on people within the other duchies. Now, Henry also was not only concerned about his stature within the empire, he was also very, very concerned about church reform. And generally, when bishoprics and archbishoprics fell vacant, he gave them to people who were very involved in different types of ecclesiastical reform movements. Now, there were many after the year 1000, and even before, there was a blossoming of ecclesiastical reform, largely because of the state of the church. And the church overall, both on a monastic level and a diocesan level, had been affected by the invasions of the Magyars, the Saracens, and the Vikings. And one of the areas that we see church reform first emerge is in Cluny. In around the year 910, we have Benedictine monks in Cluny who ask their lord for permission to revitalize and to renew their monastery. And this is what they want to do. They want to accept no land that has feudal ties attached to it. Because what had been occurring is that Benedictine monks were increasingly becoming incorporated into the world as they were receiving estates that had feudal ties attached to it, so they had to provide men to serve in battle. And so really, you can't be a good monk, and you can't be very concerned about ecclesiastical affairs if you're caught up in secular administration. So the Cluniac monks wanted exemption, and they didn't want to have land that had feudal ties attached to it, so they wanted to remove themselves from the feudal world. They also no longer wanted to be visited by the local bishop. And one of the jobs of the local bishop was to visit all the monasteries within his diocese every couple of years. But many of these bishops and archbishops that we have from the late 9th and early 10th century aren't particularly ecclesiastical personnel, that they might be appointed bishop or archbishop because they are a good political figure or a yes man. And so often a visitation would be a very expensive endeavor for the monastery, as the archbishop or bishop showed up with his retinue and you had to feed them and house them for a long period of time. So according to the charters, this new type of monastery found at Cluny is a Reformed Benedictine monastery. But it's new in the sense that A, it's trying to remove itself from the world. So it won't accept land that has feudal ties attached to it, and B, it receives exemption from episcopal visitation. In theory, the only person who can visit Cluny, the monastery there, is the Pope. And the popes in the 10th century are very much preoccupied by Roman affairs. So there's very little chance that the abbot of Cluny will be visited by the Pope. But this Cluniac reform movement spreads. And what happens is it becomes very, very popular because the Cluniacs focus on reform within the monastery, especially on the Opus Dei and the chanting of the Psalms from the old Benedictine tradition. In general, most Benedictine houses could get through the Psalms in 1 week. At a Cluniac establishment, you could get through the Psalms in 1 day. So it was almost like there was a constant psalm marathon at Cluniac houses, and the Cluniacs were immediately respected for their religiosity and for their sanctity. And people who did have money and did have spare land often gave land to these Cluniacs. And so these Reformed Benedictines, these Cluniacs, began to establish more and more houses. They were not part of the secular world because they didn't have to provide soldiers for secular lords. Remember, they only accepted land that had no secular ties attached to it. and they set a reform movement in process, which inspired contemporaries and set off many other similar reform movements. There was one in England and one in Lotharingia, all of which were monastic-based, but the goal was to separate the church from the world, that somehow the world had permeated the church. And this was seen as a bad thing because it disrupted the level of theological knowledge. It confused the sacred and the secular. And so the best way to deal with these issues was try to separate them and have clearly defined limits of what is secular and what is sacred. Of course, you can see we're going to have a collision with the Ottonian system of government. Otto and his successors had been appointing archbishops and bishops and ecclesiastical personnel as dukes. According to this new reform spirit, these people can't be dukes because they have a spiritual job, hence you cannot have a secular job. So this reform movement out of Cluny that begins to radiate from Cluny in Burgundy, but then radiates all throughout Europe, focuses on dividing the spiritual and the secular, on dividing these two and keeping them separate. Now, as it would happen, Henry III is very impressed with reform movements both in Lotharingia and at Cluny, and he begins to appoint reformers to positions throughout his own kingdom and even at Rome. In fact, he appoints several reformers as popes, and they, of course, will bring more and more of their own reformers. And so we have kind of an odd situation in which the ecclesiastical personnel in Rome adhere to a view that wants to separate the secular from the spiritual, but at the same time, they have their spiritual position by virtue of somebody secular selecting them. So you can see the obvious collision that's going to happen. And what happens is Henry III appoints several people as pope, but one of the first big ones is Leo IX. Now, in 1046, when Henry is in Rome, there are three different men claiming to be pope, and it's the typical Roman problem where, you know, the Romans really select a pope out of for political reasons. So Henry has to depose all three popes and select a new one. And he selects popes that are involved in this monastic reform movement that's been percolating throughout Europe. Okay? And what he does is he relies on these reformers, but the problem is that once they become the head of the ecclesiastical reform, they're going to try to bring this monastic reform movement to the apex of the church hierarchy and try to reform the entire church from above. That is, rid the church throughout Christendom of feudal ties. Not just monasteries, but rid the church of feudal ties. Make very separate the spiritual from the temporal. There are certain situations in which the spiritual and the temporal are confused. For many people, in the year 1000, the anointing of a king would have been seen as a sacrament because it's in the Hebrew Scriptures and it's a big public ceremony. So what the church is going to do is going to attempt to define the sacraments and to make sure that the sacraments are in the hands of ecclesiastical personnel and that they're not controlled by secular personnel. This reform movement also wants to clearly make the papacy the spiritual head of all of the church. And this reform movement begins in earnest under Pope Leo IX. And Leo is elected pope in 1049. And his pontificate lasts 5 years, 1049 to 1054. But what does Leo do? Well, Leo announces his reform movement in kind of an unusual way because of his 5-year pontificate. He spends less than 6 months in Rome. He travels north of the Alps. And he travels mainly in French, or the West Frankland lands, but he holds councils and assemblies along the way. And in 1049, he has a council in the French city of Reims, and it's there where he announces his reform program. And first and foremost, he condemns simony. And simony is the purchase or the trafficking in ecclesiastical offices. So hereafter, it becomes illegal to sell bishoprics and archbishoprics, which obviously had been a problem in the past. He then forbids clerical marriage. And also clerical concubinage. So priests can't have wives or concubines. Now, there had been repeated prohibitions in this issue throughout Western history, but there's not a full enforcement of this policy until the 11th century. And in the 11th century, we have a complete prohibition in clerical marriage. So priests can no longer marry, and we imagine that probably thousands of them were forced to leave their wives at this juncture. But what Leo does is he takes what had been really a monastic virtue, celibacy, and he puts it in the priesthood. In the Eastern Church, of course, priests continued to still marry. Now, so we have this reform program that consists of no simony, no clerical marriage. And contemporaries at first didn't see the importance, but Leo holds these councils all over the place, and he begins to suspend bishops and archbishops unless they do penance and say, oh, I'm sorry, I bought my position. There was one example where the Archbishop of Narbonne shows up to Leo and he says, look, can you help me out? I paid good money for this job. I bought it from the Archbishop of Toulouse, and now, he's taken away some of my privileges. And Leo says, and deposes him. And so this is the general manner that you begin to clean up the personnel of the church and make sure that they don't buy their office, that they're not too closely related to the secular arm. And so you can see where this reform program is going. Leo will spend his entire pontificate promoting such synods and then local councils to address these problems. And of course, from these local councils, they'll be trickled down through bishops and, archbishops, bishops, the parish priest, to the laity. And so the laity realized that, oh wait, my priest shouldn't be married, or my priest shouldn't have bought his office. So he deposes dozens of bishops for simony, for purchasing their office, and for concubinage. And so under his pontificate, clerical marriage becomes anathema, and he brings more and more of like-minded reformers. So increasingly at Rome, we have more and more people who, of this reform mind. And what happens is Henry III dies, and his son is a minor. And so there'll be a long minority for Henry IV. And during this long minority, these reformers in Rome will start to go kind of wild and come up with rules. As an example, in 1054, Leo sends a legate Humbert, to Constantinople on a papal mission. And really, without any good reason, his legate excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Emperor. And so 1054 is the Great Schism, is the division between the East and the West. But in reality, to contemporaries, it didn't mean that much. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. And for most of the reasons for the Great Schism, at the time were seen as, theologically, the issues over the filioque clause, that is the role of the Holy Spirit, the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son, which occurs in the Western tradition, or simply from the Father, which of course occurs in the East. But the reality is that the two churches had been growing separately for so long. Priests in the East did marry. In the East, they accepted vernacular languages, such as the Slavic languages, Armenian and others, whereas Latin was becoming the standard ecclesiastical language in the West. And there were minor differences too, such as the use of unleavened bread. But the reality of the split is that the two churches were simply growing apart. After Leo IX's reign, is that we're going to have a succession of popes. And one of the first things they do is Pope Nicholas II in 1059 creates the College of Cardinals. Now, cardo in Latin is a hinge verb, but there were certain people who had the title cardinal who were involved in processions, and they're grouped together into a body. And the purpose of the College of Cardinals is expressly to remove the papacy from lay interference. So the cardinals do what? The cardinals elect the pope. So now we have a set body that will elect the pope. And of course, in the first creation of the College of Cardinals, in the first charter, there is a sentence that gives due reverence to the emperor. But this is done during the minority of young Henry IV. So we have many reforms occurring at Rome. We have another reform that occurs that involves the issue of lay investiture. And one of the problems is that so many bishoprics and archbishoprics have been incorporated into the feudal world that they have, these positions have to perform feudal ties. So let's say if you're an archbishop of Mainz, you might have to provide 200 soldiers to the king for 40 days a year, okay, in addition to your spiritual capacities. So essentially you're functioning on two levels. First, you're a shepherd of souls, by virtue of being an archbishop, and you're expected to preach and do all the archiepiscopal duties. Secondly, in your secular job, you need to make sure that you can manage estates and have these knights ready. So the problem is that when an archbishop is elected, and technically canonical election must be done by other clergy. That is, kings are not supposed to appoint ecclesiastical personnel, although they have been for a very, very long period of time. When an archbishop is elected, the archbishop has to do two forms of investiture. And first, you have to do the spiritual investiture. And so that is, before you actually are anointed, you need to receive the symbols for your spiritual office. So usually a mitre, a crozier, maybe a small replica of the cathedral, a ring, something that signifies you are now something different. You're an archbishop. So you receive a physical symbol of your new status, and that is called your spiritual investiture. However, as part of the feudal ceremony, the lay feudal ceremony, you're also required to do secular investiture or lay investiture. And that means the king has to give you, say, maybe a clump of earth or a wand or a glove or something that signifies that there's a relationship between you two and that you're going to provide the 200 knights for the king for 40 days a year. Okay? What frequently was becoming the case was that it was a lot easier for the king simply to give all of the investitures. So the king would give the wand, the glove, the clump of earth to recognize that you were a secular subordinate, but then he would also give the crozier, the mitre, the model of the cathedral, or the ring, the spiritual symbols of the office, to make it look as if you were a spiritual subordinate of the king, and that the king was a spiritual superior. And these reformers at Rome immediately prohibit lay investiture because they don't want kings touching the spiritual symbols at all, because kingship, they argue, is not a sacred office. The episcopacy or the archiepiscopacy is, but kingship is a secular office. And this will begin a big crisis called the investiture controversy, which will split the Holy Roman Emperors against Rome.
Well, now that we, of course, learned about the Holy Roman Empire, for our next lecture, we'll discuss one of the Germanic tribes that will make their base of operations or their home in a place called England. They were called the Anglo-Saxons, or we know them, of course, as the Anglo-Saxons. And we'll see the development from an Anglo-Saxon king. We'll see the Vikings with a king by the name of Canute take over in England. And then, of course, we'll have what's called the Norman Conquest. So quite a lot of interesting facts and historical events taking place in England during this Middle Age, mostly the High Middle Age period. So we'll find out about the Anglo-Saxons and the Norman Conquest on our next lecture. Until next time.